Dr. Cohen, thank you for your time. Great to be with you.
It's a pleasure.
Let's jump right in. You heard what Secretary of State John Kerry said. You have put out a plan via the blog post at the Heritage Foundation on what to do. We get silence from Vladimir Putin. Is he orchestrating all of this? Is this all happening with his approval? And is this part of his plan to first go and take Crimea and then move forward?
Well, I think you're asking a $64 million question because when I'm looking at what happened this morning, they had 140 commandos taking over 3 buildings, and they had 100 commandos patrolling Yalta, my birthplace. I'm from Crimea. I know the place intimately. And it doesn't look like Russian tradecraft. Russian tradecraft is to go in with an overwhelming force. The Ukrainians are resisting this takeover. So I'm asking myself, what the heck is going on here? And I'm not sure our guys know, people in the government know. I'm not even sure Ukrainian government in Kiev knows. It's all very murky. The German strategist of the 19th century, von Clausewitz, used to call it the fog of war. But unfortunately, this war, without really shooting, it's not yet a shooting war, but the conflict already started. And I think the Russians are trying to grab the Crimea that was under their control until 1954. And even before that, in 1944, Joseph Stalin, the dictator, ethnically cleansed hundreds of thousands of Crimean Tatars, the Muslim population from there, and put Russian settlers there. So what are we looking at? We're looking at the Russian settlers who are there because of an ethnic cleansing, claiming this territory for Mother Russia, for crying out loud.
It is something that you call it the fog of war. We're sitting here and we're looking to break this down as, is it what we saw in the Cold War? Are we back to that territorial disputes, and how do we operate legally within that? What is the legal framework? You referenced the fact that Crimea was and is a part of the Ukraine according to a 1994 Budapest memorandum that was a part that would be the territory of the Ukraine. Tell me, where do we go from here?
I'm sure our listeners haven't heard about the 1994 Budapest memorandum, so let's walk through that. That's
Great.
A fascinating little-known piece of diplomacy, and that was that Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin, the Russian president, remember the guy who conducted an orchestra drunk? That guy. And the UK signed an agreement that facilitated Ukraine giving up their nuclear weapons. Ukraine, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, had hundreds of nuclear warheads. And in exchange for these warheads all of them went to Russia, the U.S., the Russians, and the Brits gave Ukrainians a piece of paper that they signed in Budapest saying that the high agreeing powers, the three great powers, are guaranteeing the territorial integrity of Ukraine, meaning nobody's going to touch it, nobody is going to dismantle it. The Crimea was given to Ukraine by the then Soviet dictator Nikita Khrushchev, and is a part of Ukraine. Nobody can dispute that. And if the Russians are trying to grab that, if the Russians are supporting separatism in the Crimea, if they're sending their troops from the naval base of Sevastopol, where they are, in accordance to the agreement signed between Ukraine and Russia, then the Russians are violating two documents. The Status of Forces Agreement that allows them to be in the Crimea in the first place, and the Budapest Protocol. So normally, and unfortunately, in situations like that, either you're trying to walk this back to where it was before, status quo ante, or you're facing a possibility of a conflict. I'm not saying that we're having a dynamic that will lead, God forbid, to war with Russia. That would be very, very dangerous. But what I'm saying is we need to walk this back to where it was. We need the Russian troops out of the Crimea. Whoever these troops are these militias, are these special forces, the tradecraft, the way they behaved, really looks to me like special forces. But it's not Russian tradecraft. Russia always goes with an overwhelming force. So this is really, really murky. And I don't think, frankly, that Vladimir Putin is very impressed by Minister Kerry's or Secretary Kerry's declarations. They were not impressed by our position in Syria when we said, oh, my goodness, we're going to war, chemical weapons, red lines. And then they walked us back. They walked us back. Putin walked Obama back. We are not impressed with, the Russians are not impressed with America's position on Iran when we said no, no, no to nuclear weapons in Iran. And then by hook or by crook, the Iranians are getting very close to getting their own nuclear weapons. So why the Russians would be impressed by our position on the Crimea and on Ukraine?
And we can even look at the missile shield and pulling back on that with Poland and Czech Republic
Correct.
as well. So
Correct.
we have those factors. So what really stops Putin from doing what he wants to do? You reference a NATO statement that you describe as harsh. You say this is a harsh statement regarding the defense of the Ukraine. Tell me,
Right.
are we seeing a shift from the United States being the leader of the free world? Is that appropriate anymore to be the United States referenced as leader of the free world? And will we see a change in this in NATO?
I think the United States today with this administration is what they themselves call leading from behind. They decided the Ukraine is the European problem, not the American problem. And there's something to it. Ukraine borders 5 NATO countries, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Turkey across the Black Sea. And the Europeans should worry about it. The problem is the Europeans were cutting their military budgets for 20 years. They have nothing to fight with. And, frankly, they don't want to fight over Ukraine. But this dynamic reminds me of, for example, German aggression in World War I. I don't want to compare Putin to Hitler. It's totally different. But even German aggression in early 1930s, when they marched into the borderland between Germany and France called the Rhineland, which was demilitarized according to the peace treaty of Versailles after World War I, and they just grabbed it, and nobody said anything. And then they went to Austria and grabbed that, and nobody said anything. And then they said, oh, we're going to protect the German speakers, the ethnic Germans, in a place called Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. And nobody did anything, and that was a Munich peace agreement with Hitler. And then we ended up in a huge world war in which 55 million people, including 6 million Jews, died. So I'm not saying we're down the same slope, but people who are aggressive, people who are truculent, if they're not stopped, horrible things happen, especially in Europe.
Well, looking at the wages of appeasement there and just adding that all up, and what you have referenced that before in the sense of this growing and this being a very serious conflict, and it's murky as you just described, and you've walked us through in the remaining moments. Now what I'd like you to do is go into the room with Secretary of State John Kerry. He says, look, I realize you just laid out, yes, we are leading from behind, and it's been a disaster, so we're looking to change. We're hoping for change. We're hoping you can provide it for us. Dr. Cohen, what should we do?
I think we should declare our own military exercise in the Mediterranean, not right next to the Russian territory, the Russian huge exercise. We didn't talk about it, but yesterday, all Russian military in Europe went on alert. They mobilized 150,000 troops. They got hundreds of aircraft and helicopters in the air, 880 tanks. 880 tanks. That's a lot of darn tanks are on the move. The paratroopers were flown to Sevastopol, the Russian naval base on the Black Sea.
Yes.
And it doesn't look good. If I was a Ukrainian leader today in a country that is 2 minutes from bankruptcy. I would be scared.
Yep.
And I would bring a couple of aircraft carriers into the Mediterranean, and then
Gotcha.
quietly, not openly. I don't think
20 seconds.
this is a time for a megaphone. This is
Okay.
a time for a red line. You bring overwhelming naval force into the Mediterranean, about 1,800 kilometers from the Russian borders, 2,000 kilometers, 1,200 miles.
Yes, sir.
And say, hey, Vladimir, step down.
Gotcha.
Step down.
Dr. Ariel Cohen, thank you. Senior Research Fellow, Russian and Eurasian Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you for your time, sir. We really appreciate it. Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth, AFR Talk.